is a possible increase in community COVID cases. And thanks again to Chum and Sally for their generosity in hosting a number of community meetings at the pavilion. This time, Sean O'Callahan, Planning Director, and Catherine Daly, Planner for Gallatin County, are providing the technical resources and insight to allow for this remote community meeting, which we all greatly appreciate. In addition, we appreciate the commitment of Marcia Booth, our Secretary Treasurer for the Alliance, in keeping Alliance members and the Springhill community at large informed. We'd also like to thank Jessen Brimmer, Legal Counsel for the Alliance, for her service and participation throughout the course of this meeting. And now Jeff will touch on the objectives subject to discussion this evening.
Oh, sorry. Or do you want to start with the agenda, Jeff? Or hello?
Looks like we might have lost Jeff.
Oh, really?
I can see his face, but it looks like he's frozen.
He looks pretty focused.
But he looks really focused.
Yeah, he does.
We'll just pause for a moment and see if he's able to rejoin here.
Yeah.
Catherine and Sean.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Great. Hey, while Jeff's trying to sign back in, if you want to go to the next slide, I think it's the next slide, I'm not sure, but there's a list of, I just wanted to make a note with respect to the definitions under bullet point 3. This evening, when I was going back through this regulation, I found the definitions of non-wooded site and wooded site, just not in the alphabetical order in which I was looking for them under N or W, or even S apostrophe N or S apostrophe W. I found them under building site, which maybe is a planning convention that I'm just not familiar with, or maybe it was just trying to make sense because it modifies building site. But anyway, I just wanted to mention to the group that they are there. They're under building sites, and I would defer to the two of you, I guess, to some degree to say, yeah, this is the way we should do it. But I just, because I didn't find it the first couple of times I looked for it, I thought, well, maybe other people had the same trouble I did. So
Sure.
Just wanted to make that clarification. And so, Bill, do you want to check with Jeff and see if he's...
You know, I just received a text and he said that he had a power interruption. The system was really offline. He's trying to rejoin now. So.
Okay. Well, I guess either you or I could go through his second slide if you guys wanted to continue to make progress. I think it would, the intention was just to introduce everyone to where you all have been in the process.
Justin, I think it would be great if you just stepped in and moved forward from that. So.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure exactly how Jeff was planning on going through this, but I think the intention was just to kind of recap the process. And, you know, Sean and Catherine, if you have anything to add with respect to this, I'm seeing the slide, let's see, I guess outlines the August 12th Planning and Zoning Commission hearing in which the Part 1 administrative zoning regulation was adopted into the Springhill ordinance, or there was a recommendation by the Planning and Zoning Commission. And then August 31st, the County Commission actually formally adopted the administrative regulation as it was amended back in July into what is now called the Springhill Zoning Regulation. So that just married those two documents. And then in September, the Planning and Zoning Commission discussion was deferred because we were going to talk about a resolution of intention with respect to this matter and making these amendments. And it was to allow more time for community involvement and another community meeting and a more comprehensive red line. And then we tried to have the meeting last week. That didn't happen. And we understand that following this meeting today on the 22nd, you guys are going to submit a resolution of intention with a red line to the Planning and Zoning Commission. And I would say, if that's not correct, maybe let us know. Is that?
Yeah,
I see
there doesn't need
not.
to be a resolution of intention.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
it would be, oh, go ahead, Sean.
It's a resolution from the Planning and Zoning Commission, and it would be how they forward. It's the tool or format they use to forward their recommendation to the county commission.
Okay.
So,
Mhm.
Okay. And then that October 14th meeting is where their recommendation would happen. So it's not formally a resolution, and we would have this sort of red line that is an updated red line with the outcome of the discussions this evening. Right. And
Yeah,
then
so they passed, the Planning and Zoning Commission passed the resolution of intention in September that
Okay.
basically authorized the planning department to start having these conversations. And
Okay.
then, and that's why we worked on defining sort of the scope of these amendments for that resolution of intention. So we say, generally for the purposes of preserving and upholding the agricultural intents and purposes of the Springhill Zoning Regulation and clarifying these like sort of typographical issues.
yeah,
And then
updated definitions.
yeah, exactly. And then at the October Planning and Zoning Commission meeting, we would present a resolution of recommendation along with, a document that reflects the outcomes of this meeting. So that's what would be up for discussion then. And,
Okay.
if they recommend to the commission adoption, then it will be moving forward to the commission.
Right. And I think if you go back to the other slide, there was like a TBD date for that next step, right?
Yes.
October TBD, County Commission meeting formal adoption. So there's the
Mhm.
hearing in October 14th to discuss whatever amendments are on the table, and then the County Commission meeting. Okay, well, I'm not sure if Jeff made it back yet, but
Yeah, I did make it back. It could be a long night. I don't know if you could see those lights flickering right before I lost power, so I apologize. Justin, it sounds like you may have been covering the chronology and then the amendments not reflected in the red line in terms of clarity.
right. Well, I did. I deferred to Bill, but he declined. So yes,
Okay.
I went through the last slide, and I did offer a clarification with respect to bullet point 3 and the definition of non-wooded and wooded site. I just explained to everyone that I was able to locate those, just not where I expected to find them under N or W or even S. They're actually under building site, and I deferred to Catherine and Sean as to maybe that was included under building site as modification of that term and not, under the normal alphabetical convention that I was accustomed to looking. So anyway, they're there. So when we get to that discussion, that's helpful to see that they're there. But so if you want to jump off with 1, 2, and the 2 bullet points under definitions and the remainder of it to the extent that needs to be.
Yeah, I wasn't going to kind of read through all of these. I thought it was important to cite these. It sounds like, Catherine, you maybe have covered with Justin some of the reasons, and maybe Sean, reasons why, we don't have a red line that reflects all of these changes. It's been a fairly iterative process. There's a fair amount of complexity as we're trying to make sure that this is talking to the administrative regs in the appropriate way, and that they are fully complementary. You know, one of the things that I think we wanted to emphasize for the group here is that ambiguity, at least, you know, with more exposure to frankly zoning processes than I ever anticipated, ambiguity tends to work not for the community based upon what I've observed, not for the Planning and Zoning Commission, who's charged or is accountable with enforcing our ordinance or going forward our regulations, but for the individual who is focused on trying to exploit some loophole. Again, that's just based upon observation with a few case studies I've seen. So one thing I want to emphasize here in terms of the recommendations we've made is just to err on the side of over communication, or what I consider to be kind of, or what I refer to as belt and suspenders type documentation. You know, if we say it and say it again, that's fine, as long as they sync between the two documents. That's the complement we're looking for. That's the clarity that should reduce friction within our community going forward and make the Planning and Zoning Commission's job at least a little easier. It's going to remain tough, but at least a little easier, again, as they're interpreting and enforcing these regulations across 15 different Part 1 districts. On the chronology, the only thing, I don't want to go backwards here, just as it relates to clarity, we wanted to make sure everyone understood the path forward. You know, in July 1st, the Planning Department had a good constructive outreach session. We had the last pavilion meeting on the 13th. On the 15th, there was the hearing where the admin regs were, I think, recommended, and subsequently in early August, I guess, adopted by the commission. But this is a process that we are now really almost 18 months into. It has been a long, fairly exhaustive process. It's been an expensive process, both in terms of time and dollars. And it's been a bit of a challenge to follow, particularly for folks who haven't been as immersed into it. So we very much appreciate everyone attending this session, being prepared to provide input, and
Oh no. Poor Jeff.
Yeah, apparently the hydro plant is causing some power outages in the community. That's what I had heard from some other people.
Really interesting. Well, do you think we should just start with the proposed amendments and just systematically start working through those and discuss?
Yeah, well, Rob, I actually prepared a bunch of slides that sort of addresses all of the amendments that the planning department has comments on and ideas and would love feedback on. And they're pretty detailed. So I would love to start introducing those. And they start out with some of these administrative requests on this current slide. So yeah, if you all are ready, I'd love to just dive right in. I'm not hearing anybody saying they're not ready.
No, I do want to note, when Jeff dropped off before, I think several others did too, and we were up to 20 participants and we're down to 15. So he's not the only one we lost again.
Okay, shoot.
As much as we want to stay on kind of making progress with the meeting, a quarter of the people were booted off. We need to be sensitive to that, so we're not having to repeat something we've already discussed.
Okay.
If you want to advance to those slides so that we can just kind of be prepared to systematically go through them when it seems like they rejoin, it might make sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is just the beginning of our slide. I tried to, let's see, Randy Weichertley says she's joining by phone, which might be a better option, or at least she's suggesting that folks join by phone.
Yeah. I think that's good advice.
Yeah, I was just about to ask folks to text and possibly get folks to call in on their cell. That should still be working.
I haven't seen anybody else come back into the meeting since we lost Jeff. Have you,
No.
Sean?
No, I haven't. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. I think it's just a good idea to try and have as many people that are trying to participate in the meeting participate in it rather than us proceed
Mhm.
without them.
So, Bill, this is Phil Olson. Maybe we should text Jeff to see if he'd like to join by telephone.
I just did actually, and he said he's working on it. So.
Okay.
It may be worth sending a quick email to the whole list to suggest trying to come in by cell phone.
Marcia Booth just rejoined, so I expect we'll get a flurry of folks here within the next couple minutes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Here we go.
So while we're waiting, I'm currently out of state in Tennessee. What's the weather like in Bozeman?
About as nice of a fall day as you could ask for today.
Great. I mean, I understand we got some snow in the high country. What's the fire report? Any update on fires?
I don't have a
Nothing
good
other
update.
than,
Yeah.
yeah, nothing other than I would guess they're probably better than they were a month ago at this time.
Jeff sent a request that we just touch on the objectives, which are on the slide, which was to update the community on process to date and probable path to it and timeline looking forward. Focus time and attention on remaining short list of issues with our Springhill regulations, coordination with the planning department. Engage broader Springhill community in discussions and input around open issues and possible concerns. Solidify final Springhill ordinance amendments, recommendations on the basis of the red line for all to review ahead of the October hearing. And other topics, not for tonight, but just for consideration, are the Springhill Advisory Board, a 5-person board comprised of Springhill community property owners occupying primary residences, still building the slate for those who might be interested in that. And then the other one was the physical notice posting locations, 3 locations with good visibility and traffic within the community. A couple of suggestions were the school, the church, and then we're another open that perhaps people can provide suggestions for. So.
Great. And if we have extra time tonight and you all generate some suggestions and this moves forward, we can even practice posting in those locations for October's Planning and Zoning Commission meeting and see what kind of a reaction we get. So there will be an opportunity to test those locations if you so desire.
Very good.
While we're waiting, oops, sorry.
Yeah, as well as using the email notification process. Catherine, is that correct, Catherine? Not just
Yeah.
posting it, but circulating it via email.
Yeah, we are still working with our IT department on how to actually make that happen. Our IT director wants us to build in that functionality into our website, which has a lot of functions, and the notifications function is one that is, I guess, underutilized. And so they are working with the developers who run the back end of our website to build that function for us right now.
Catherine, that brings up a question. Have you all made any progress on the other components of the notice that we discussed?
We're just focusing on that for now because that
Okay.
was, I think, the priority that we heard from everybody.
Mhm.
But we are actually using one of Bozeman's physical signs right now in a
Okay.
zone text amendment that we're undertaking, and we're actually getting to see how they work, and that's really helpful sort of empirical research for us. So yeah, that's a great question.
I think we got Jeff back, and we're back up to 20 participants, so.
Right.
Okay, well, now that everyone is back, Randy made the great suggestion that if, you know, the power continues to be unreliable, there is an option to call in on your phone. We won't be able to see your beautiful faces, but at least you'll be able to chat with us and listen into the conversation. So that's an option too. But without further ado, let's see. So I wanted to address those questions and requests about the administration section of the Springhill Zoning Regulation and sort of administrative provisions in general. We heard a request for updating section 1.6 to reflect the terms that the Springhill Zoning Regulation used for permitted and conditional uses. And we're more than happy to do that. There was also a request for the addition of a section on development rights, and we're happy to include that. We think it makes sense in the administration section of the regulation. I just highlighted the section number 7 because that's, I believe, the new section that discusses transfers of development rights in the updated zoning regulation. But otherwise, that is something we would be happy to include in the regulation, and that's something we've been talking about for a long time now. As for introducing new language pertaining to, for example, conditional uses, I did double check with the Part 1 zoning administrative regulation, and section 3.2 of the regulation directly addresses, let's see, basically uses allowed in a sub-district. It says no building, structure, or land in any sub-district may be used for any purpose unless such use is listed as a permitted or conditional use in that sub-district, and approval for that use is obtained through the proper procedure, ... And we actually made sure in our amendments to the Part 1 administrative regulation that our definitions, Jeffen made sure our definitions of permitted use and conditional use reflect the terms that Springhill uses for permitted and conditional uses. To just make absolutely sure that this, this provision applies and there's no confusion. So I guess the planning, Sean and I are just sort of unclear about what sort of additional protection or benefit the provision relating to conditional uses would provide. And we actually think those, it's sort of covered in, or it is covered in the administrative regulation currently. So we don't necessarily see a need to include it. Sean, do you have anything else you want to add relating to that?
No, and maybe I'm hoping Jeff is still with us, because referencing his sort of belt and suspenders approach that he mentioned earlier, you know, in some instances, we're certainly in favor of that and it makes sense. In other instances where there's language that's largely redundant with something that's covered in the administrative regulations, you know, it's because it's an administrative provision. We really want that language in the administrative regulations. We've tried to remove as much of that from the text of the individual zoning regulations, just to alleviate conflicts and make streamline in terms of process, any necessary updates to administrative provisions in the future. Of course, we will follow the appropriate notice protocol to make sure the residents of all 15 Part 1 districts are noticed, but just trying to avoid some of that administrative overlap.
All right, and I think sort of the same applies to these provisions relating to non-conforming parcels uses. And oh, sorry.
Before you move on to the next one, I just got a text from Jeff asking me to comment on that, and
oh, sure.
And I think I can relay. I think the interest in having it in the regulation is that the first place people go, and me included as an attorney, and I actually had this very conversation with another attorney today. The first place we go when we look at land use issues, right, is the zoning district, the actual zoning regulation for the district. We don't go to the administrative regulation unless and until we get to the procedural parts of it. So to that extent, I think it's important for people who are using the district regulation to have something that, especially with respect to the overarching uses of land, right? To say that no building, structure, or land in any subdistrict can be used for any purpose unless it's listed as a permitted or conditional use. It's really helpful so that people are reminded of that, because I mean, I know you two deal with zoning every day, right? It's what you live and breathe, and it's what you know, but I deal with many people who don't have that same experience with zoning, and frankly, a lot of times don't even realize zoning exists on their property until something comes up. So I think the reason for the request, and the language can be that paragraph and have a cross-reference to the administrative regulation if that makes you more comfortable. But I think the request is just to put people on notice when they look at the Springhill regulation for the first time, that there is this construct, right? There are these permitted uses and there are these conditional uses. And if it's not one of those, then it's frankly just not an option here. So it goes, as Sean acknowledged, it goes to the belt and suspenders. So I just would respectfully request, unless anyone on the call has an objection, and feel free to chime in if anyone finds this confusing, but to have this small level of redundancy, I think is actually helpful.
I guess I don't understand why there's been so much included in this that wasn't in the original zoning ordinance, as far as, I mean, the change in building height, the change in grade, the change in this and that doesn't seem to me to add anything to it. It's more restrictive, and I don't think it's what the original zoning was for. So maybe I could be aided in understanding that better.
Maybe, can you hear me now?
Yes.
This is Jeff. Bruce, let me come back to that for a second, because I think we might, it's gotta be, we talk about building heights, there were restrictions in there that we've addressed. There was wooded, non-wooded, that was existing. We're trying to bring additional clarity to that, and so we can come to that here in a second. But going back to your point, Sean, in terms of belt and suspenders, development rights is probably one of the most contentious, prospective definitions in all the ordinance and in our entire community. There's significant value attached. So if there's one area where we err on the side of being redundant, look, I'm all for being as frugal as possible with the language, but even Justin's comment with regard to cross-referencing. So Bruce, this isn't more restrictive. This is about clarity as it relates to our development rights, where we've got definitions that have moved between the two documents, and we need to make sure they sync, right, or they cross-reference back. In this case, if it's rock solid in the administrative regs and we cross-reference that to Justin's point, I don't think that causes heartburn for us. We just want to make it very clear because Justin's comment is spot on, right? There's a complete mixed bag in terms of people's understanding of what regulations or ordinance they signed up to when they purchased property in this area. So again, you know, that's a little bit of the belt and suspenders comment. If we're going to be a little redundant, this would be one area where I think it's important to do it. Bruce, maybe we can come back as we're hitting individual issues on those areas where you think we're more restrictive, because I think for the most part, it's about clarity, but there may be a couple of areas where, you know, that's something we need to drill down on.
Okay, that's good, because some of them do seem to be more restrictive from the way I look at it.
Okay.
Yeah. and I
Sean,
just-
is that,
go ahead,
is
Jeff.
that, well, I was just wondering, Sean, Catherine, with your experience, again, you're trying to interpret this and apply it across all the Part 1 zones. So, you know, we want to try to work with you to make sure the documents do sync, but you understand our sensitivity.
I understand
Yeah.
your sensitivity and what you're trying to accomplish. And I think, you know, without including the full set of proposed language, but making sure there's an easy to understand cross-reference and direction to the administrative regulations to address that topic, we can try and accomplish that. I think that's productive middle ground there that I think satisfies our concern and hopefully accomplishes what you're trying to accomplish too. So.
Yeah, we do have that section 1.6 in the administration section of the Springhill Zoning Regulation that talks about the Part 1 zoning administrative regulation. And I am speaking off the cuff here, but potentially we could include something like that there. Although I'm hearing that having that reference at the sub-district level might be more user-friendly.
At the risk of being redundant, I want to go back to Jessen's point about someone who doesn't know anything about development rights, zoning regulations in Springhill. If they show up and are interested in acquiring a piece of property, I think our hope is that there would be a map that basically would provide them with the guidelines to be able to understand exactly what their options would be with regards to developing the property. And so I think that's the goal, as I understand it from our side, and hopefully that makes sense to you. And so we just got to make sure that the map is clear so that if someone shows up for the very first time, they're not going to be confused or they're not going to be misled in thinking they can do something with a piece of property that in actuality they cannot.
Yeah, and actually that's a really great point, and I appreciate the group's focus on this, and that's something that the planning department is trying to address, not just in individual regulations, but in terms of how we interact with folks who reach out to our department. When folks get an address, for example, if they're building a new home, they have to fill out a property information request form, and that goes to the GIS department, and then it also goes to us as well as the environmental health department. And they have to tell us what their proposed project is, and we do a quick scan of it to make sure to see whether it's compliant with the underlying zoning regulation. So they get something in writing from us that's signed and dated that says, this is what zoning district you're in. You're proposing a residential use, looks good, or you're proposing something that's not allowed in this district. So, and I know that this is sort of a companion topic, but I thought it would be helpful to know that the planning department is doing this for all of our zoning districts every time somebody comes in with a property information request form. I think, Sean, one of the other projects we're working on to help better communicate with property owners in Gallatin County is a sort of like introductory package that provides sort of basic information on zoning regulations and that kind of thing, to help increase people's familiarity with sort of what's going on in their district and processes that they may need to follow. Sean, do you have any updates? I can't remember what the status of that project is. I haven't.
Yeah, I think it's, part of our work plan for this year. It's, I think, a medium priority project, and with some of the staffing changes we're having, I'm to be direct, I'm not sure when we're going to get to that, but it is on the work plan. It's on our radar. So.
Yeah, so it is. The planning department is aware that there is a big learning curve when somebody moves the county and is trying to sort of decipher whether they're in a zoning district or not. And through these broader mechanisms that are not necessarily district specific, we're trying to help get people the information they need to be compliant right off the bat.
Sure.
So that's also another companion piece that hopefully is working to help bring people into the loop.
I think to head off a lot of problems, I think we would like to see people be educated before they acquire the piece of property, then find out they can't do what they thought they could do. So there's two different pieces of this. One, before people acquire a piece of property, being able to understand what can or cannot be developed. And then secondly, for those who either already own a piece or have acquired it and want to do something with it, I think there's a couple of different places, but the earlier we can educate people on what they can do or not do on a piece of property, I think the more problems we're going to head off.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that's definitely a big part of what the planning department's role is just fielding calls from potential buyers or real estate agents or potential developers, asking whether the property that they're interested in can meet their needs or meet their expectations. So that's actually a huge part of what we do. But yeah, it's hard to catch everybody, and any ideas that we have. And I think taking a multi-pronged approach to this is necessary and helpful.
Does the planning department have an outreach, via email, whatever it might be, to the real estate community, where you're doing education there to making resources available to them? So if they've got buyers that are interested, that they have, it's easy for them to find out what conforming uses would be. Are you doing that? Do you have an outreach like that going now?
Yeah, actually, I know Sean recently put on an annual floodplain training for real estate agents.
Yeah.
Sean,
I do. Yeah, I do at least a couple outreaches through the Gallatin Association of Realtors every year, and sometimes have things that go out in their newsletters, etc. The biggest tool that we really have to help with specific things is, our interactive mapper that shows zoning and has links to our zoning regulations, and that property information request form that can also be used by someone who's got a question about property they're planning to acquire, not property they already own. And it really goes in waves. Right after we do some sort of outreach, there's certainly an uptick in those requests and people using it for that purpose, and then it kind of settles back down, and we do another outreach and it ticks back up. So it's not something that all the realtors are using as part of their normal due diligence process.
okay, so I think this is a great discussion, and I'm going to put a pin in it a little bit because I want to make sure we get to some of these other key topics related to the zoning regulation. But before we move on, I just want to recap what I heard about administration, which is, we're going to include, update those terms in section 1.6. We're going to include, as we stated, that new provision 1.7 related to development rights, because we understand that's really important to the Springhill zoning district. And then Sean and I will try and come up with a concise cross-reference to the administrative regulation that is also user-friendly when it comes to things like conditional use permits and non-conforming uses, parcel signs, and structures. Did I get that right? Am I missing anything? Not hearing any, whoa, stop. So I'm gonna go to the next slide. And I see some comments have come in about building height. We will get there in just a minute, but we're gonna start with everybody's favorite topic. Those of you who were on a call earlier this year might remember this slide. I updated it slightly to reflect the increase in structure height for non-wooded sites. But basically, we've been hearing lots of concerns over this issue about non-wooded versus wooded sites in relation to a structure's height. So this provision is in the design standards section of the regulation and was in the original Springhill zoning ordinance. So that has sort of been there since the inception. And what we are realizing is that this provision is kind of difficult to interpret and difficult to enforce. And so there have been a lot of conversations and a lot of work put in on the Alliance's side, as I understand it, to try and figure out how to clarify this. On this slide, I've included the current definition of building site. There are a number of interrelated definitions that sort of go into this one provision of the design standards that reads, no structure shall exceed 35 feet in height. Structures on non-wooded sites shall not exceed 28, in this case, that's the proposed change, feet in height. And so we have to figure out what all of that means. So I'm going to bring us to the next slide, which includes a bunch of proposed definitions to help clarify the matter. And Sean and I went around and around on this, thinking about how this could be enforced. If the planning department was sent out there with a measuring tape, how could we do this? If the planning and zoning commission were looking at this, what would they think of it? And one of the things that came to mind that we would be interested in hearing your feedback on is whether or not the goal of this design standard, which we understand, and please correct us if we're wrong, is just to make sure that buildings above a certain height, as proposed, it sounds like that would be 28 feet, just are designed in such a way to be sensitive to the surrounding landscapes and not be overly, not burdensome, but adversely affect, surrounding property owners, the view shed, this kind of thing. And one of the potential workarounds that we thought might be a little bit more efficient and is already provided for in the processes outlined in the administrative regulation is that the Springhill folks, you all choose one height standard. And then anything above that, folks could either, and we can talk about the differences here, but folks could either apply for a variance, which is the standard procedure for, getting relief from a dimensional standard of the zoning regulation, or, a conditional use permit to exceed that standard, potentially, between a certain range, like greater than 28 feet, but no more than 35 feet, something to that effect. We have a similar provision for accessory dwelling units in the Gallatin Canyon Big Sky Zoning Regulation. Basically, those are capped at a certain number of square feet, and if you want more, then you can go through the conditional use permitting process. and there are certain criteria that you have to meet, and there's a public hearing, and basically the project is evaluated, and the criteria include sort of adverse impacts on neighbors, among other things. So that is one way of handling this that would potentially sidestep a lot of the difficulties that arise when you're trying to define all of these conditions on the ground that you want to be in place for folks to have a building of a certain height. So that is sort of our proposal for this. And then we also have some ideas about how to structure the definition of building height and the complementary definition of grade. So we can get to that in a moment, but I wanted to introduce this first because I think this is a sort of meatier issue and a potentially bigger change. So I would love to hear any initial thoughts on this. Feel free to hop right in.
Yeah, I have a thought and a question. With as much as we know about the topography out there, why is it not? Why aren't we able to come up with a map which would pretty much like a flood map, a flood zone map that shows which properties are wooded sites, which ones are not wooded sites, which ones are riparian woodland? Why do we have to be so vague when we have the topography is not going to change out there? I don't know that anybody's going to go and plant trees on their property to try to qualify it as a wooded site. I mean, so why don't we just put a map that shows which areas are wooded and which ones are non-wooded and which ones are riparian?
Yeah, that's a great question. Is that Phil?
That is.
Okay, that's a great question, Phil. And that's something that Sean and I sort of touched on in our discussions about this, is really, well, first of all, you could have a forest fire or any kind of fire, a wildland fire, and that would really, really change your landscape. And then the map would be more difficult to use and interpret. And B, it seems entirely possible that someone would go out there and plan to include a bunch of landscaping to try and qualify for a structure of a certain height. Okay. So, and really, I think that would put the Planning and Zoning Commission in potentially, tricky position to say, well, you can't have the extra height right now, but in 40 years or something like that, maybe you have a fast growing tree like an aspen, yeah, you'll be fine. So it gets really tricky really quickly with that kind of standard. And that's why we're proposing, this process that exists and just sort of setting that standard and offering the option if they really want a taller structure, whatever your, maximum height is, if they really want it, then they can go through this, public review process.
So a couple of things to piggyback on that. In addition to people being willing to plant trees to screen a home, perhaps. There's also the situation that I could foresee happening is after we would create a map like that, someone might come in and cut down some trees, which would result in a structure being more obtrusive. And that sort of concept is one thing that I think is potentially beneficial of the conditional use permit process, because it would allow the Planning and Zoning Commission to attach conditions of approval related to maintenance of screening type vegetation and things like that to a taller structure.
What if you tied it to aerial photography, most recent aerial photography, though, which would take into consideration damage from a forest fire or even someone planting trees, which is certainly a possibility, I guess, but just seems like we're complicating things here instead of simplifying them by being as we're intending to be, to define this, but it seems like it's still somewhat confusing.
Yeah. So if I may, I'd love to read a chat that came in from Randy. So she says, with respect to building height and other definitions that impact allowable building height, people come out here and see the existing buildings, then assume they can build something similar. Whoops. But with the new definitions, the height limitation ends up being reduced, so they would not be able to build a house like mine or like Bill Wright's or others. With respect to building height and other definitions that impact allowable, sorry, it's hard for me to get to the right comment. I like having a single height with the added wording that the building should be sensitive to the topography and surrounding area. And to allow houses similar to existing houses, the height should be the taller height of 35 feet. We don't want the zoning area to be an HOA. Randy, do you have any other sort of thoughts that you want to add? Not hearing anything.
Just as context, where maybe Randy can come off, it looks like, oh, she's apparently can only type, I see. So part of the change here, and Bruce, going back to your comment, you know, this is in the style guideline, which has been there, it was 26 feet. We had a good conversation, and Phil, I'm going to be coming to you because I think you're one of our resident experts on this topic to contextualize 35 feet with some of the commercial structures maybe in town. But so it was 26 feet. We had a good discussion. The reality was that the wooded versus non-wooded kind of concept here, which I understand is a little hard to interpret, was there because in a more mature wooded area, you're naturally breaking up the sight line. And as Randy, I think, in some of her work had pointed out with Google Maps, there's not a lot of the Springhill district where that applies, which is absolutely true, but there are some areas where it does. And so in part, we were talking about 10-foot tall ceilings, tall people, and we kind of moved to 28 feet, assuming that would provide that kind of frame of reference. Remember, this does not apply to ag buildings. But, you know, again, Phil, maybe you can jump in and contextualize a little bit, if you don't mind me putting you on the spot, you know, kind of where we're at when we talk about 35 feet and the limitations here.
Okay,
Well,
go ahead, Phil.
No, go ahead, Bill. Is that you, because you did some research, did you not, on some of the
Right.
buildings in the valley and how tall they are for comparison's sake?
I think that starting with Randy's comments about, you know, the idea of saying, look, you want just even two floors that were 10-foot ceilings, and that would be typically a 22-foot external. The critical issue, I think, is a clear definition of the actual, as the ordinance now has, it's based on the grade at the front of the building. The biggest single problem with the current is that folks can use the formulas to create what I think are relatively artificial heights. So if you go to a standard height, irrespective of roof design, and you define it as the top point of the roof, and you have a clear definition of, as is now said, grade at the front of the building. But the key thing is, again, you need to address that it's unexcavated grade or non-altered. But to address 28 feet, if you have a 612 pitch roof, that's, you can pick any number, but it's based on the width of the front of the building. So that, for example, the 30-foot wide front has got 15-foot vertical. And the current formula, that would actually, if you took it with the highest point of the roof to the highest eave, would end up being approximately 28 to 30 feet. I think the simpler thing to do is really picking up what Catherine just said, run through. If we set some relatively reasonable allowed height such as say 28 feet, and that then a max height of 35 feet without trying to deal with formulas. That may simplify this. Currently, the big issue is also defining, well, wooded clearly is in the diagrams. I think it's pretty fair. Randy made this point in previous conversation or communication that really, according to the old 30-year-old diagram, the only wooded site in the context of that design manual is probably the mountainside above Tyke and Barber, or above Chum and Sally's place. Hopefully that's some help.
Great. I want to jump in here, and because I'm thinking of other considerations. I want to stick with this topic of whether to sort of keep the standard of wooded site, non-wooded site building, having this having them embedded in the building site definition or related to that, and then this issue of riparian woodland, like whether we want to go in that direction. Because I think some other considerations that Sean and I came up with when thinking about this is that, encouraging people, basically giving folks an incentive to build a taller building, when there's adequate tree cover, we think might have a, perverse outcome of encouraging folks to build in areas prone to forest fires and potentially increase the risk there. So I think that's another concern that we had with this kind of a standard, and which is why we were thinking that it, the concerns basically about community impacts and aesthetics and that kind of thing could be addressed very well through the conditional use permit or variance process. Because, for example, with conditional use permits, the whole reason behind them, just to remind everyone, is, or the reason behind the name is that conditions can be applied to the approval of those permits, whereby, the property owner has to, for example, plant trees that will eventually grow to be quite tall, or, provide some other mitigation measure. So I guess I just wanted to bring the conversation back to that, to this aspect of this question. And it sounds like I'm hearing that folks might be interested in a simpler standard for height. And we can talk about that shortly, but I wanted to get some feedback on this possibility of moving away from this grove of definitions, as you might call them, related to a site being wooded or not, and get the group thinking about whether they think that a conditional use permit process or the option of a variance might provide sort of the same benefit and might serve the same function, especially if these definitions are still included in the design, the companion design manual. So they're still there, and they're still there for reference. And I think the Springhill Zoning Regulation says, please be aware that this manual exists and consider it. So it wouldn't disappear entirely, and it could still be used as a reference when somebody is, potentially requesting a taller building, but it might bring some clarity to the process. So any thoughts on that, separate from how tall we're thinking a structure could be? Also, Sean, if you want to chime in.
Catherine, I just posted a question related to the CUP part of it. I'm not tracking with the CUP as an option for a deviation from the design standards so much. I'm accustomed to the variance process being allowed for that, but I'm just trying to understand when an applicant would apply for one versus the other, because as we know, the variance criteria are much more difficult to meet than the CUP criteria. And my understanding was CUP is referred to uses. It's a conditional use permit, not necessarily a deviation from a design standard. And in looking at the review criteria, if the use has to meet the building height, it's just that's why I'm having a hard time understanding that is an option. And maybe something's changed over time and I'm
Yeah,
just not.
I think it is an option, Justin, and we use this in some of our other zoning districts and it works quite well.
Okay.
You know, basically the standard that you're referring to is that the use complies with all applicable, you know, development standards, and that would include things like setbacks, building height, other
Mhm.
things. You know, we've interpreted that consistently as if there's a provision in the regulation that allows you to exceed one of those standards through the conditional use permit process, then that is consistent. So that's not a barrier at all. But your point is a good one, about a variance versus a conditional use permit.
Right.
A variance is usually limited to situation where there is some hardship. So,
Right.
you know, let's say we're talking about a variance from a property line setback. Someone needs to reduce that setback because the property has a steep slope and they need to slide a building closer to a property line because that's the only buildable location on the property.
Mhm.
So it's usually something that's out of the landowner's control, and you know, physical characteristics of the property are a classic example.
Right.
You know, Big Sky has provisions, and Four Corners has provisions, just two that are popping into the top of my head, that allow the conditional use permit process to exceed some sort of development standard. And they're, you know, they're very specific about which ones you can seek a conditional use permit for. So in this case, we would have to draft the language
Okay.
very narrowly, to use the example that Catherine has on the screen. You know, it would be to allow a building in excess of 28 feet, but less than 35 feet.
Mhm.
That's helpful clarification, Sean. It wasn't clear to me that this was going to require an additional amendment to the zoning regulation to provide for that option. So that's helpful clarification.
So I have another question when it comes to the definitions. This wooded site, when it says a building site characterized predominantly by dense and extensive mature tree cover, which includes an abundance of healthy trees and other wooded vegetation. Is there a reason why we don't use a percentage of that building site that has trees on it, as opposed to having to rely on words like predominantly and abundance, which can be misunderstood?
You know, Phil, that's really the problem with this whole thing. It's just, as Catherine said at a very early meeting, I think, or maybe misquoting, you really can't expect planning staff to go out and count trees and, you know, measure size. The challenge is really saying, also, as we've talked about and Catherine raised, do you want, you know, for instance, a wooded site, probably current fire issues, especially this year, be conscious of having some setback. But what's the goal of this? The goal is to try and prevent sky ridge busters, or, you know, basically buildings that tower over the surrounding trees or dominate the landscape to the detriment of the neighbors. And I honestly think at this point, for instance, Catherine's suggestion of using a number, let's say 28 feet, and then some maybe CUP process to go to 35. Challenge with that is, you know, once you set the CUP guide, you know, the real number will be 35. Is that what we want? Maybe it is.
Right, and that's why I put variance on this slide as well, because the criteria are much more stringent. You know, you have to demonstrate hardship. And so really it's about what the community is aiming for with this standard. Like, do you want folks to be able to have up to 35 feet and just to be able to mitigate it? Or do you want to really just set a harder limit somewhere and say, okay, you know, really you can do whatever you want up to this height. Otherwise, you know, you have to demonstrate hardship on your site, like your site is tiny and each floor would only be 200 square feet. And so you have to have 4 floors or something. You know what I mean? I don't, or, you know, you're building a fire department, for example, and they need to have a certain height to accommodate their fire trucks, which is probably a more reasonable example than the first one. But yeah, it is about, you know, what the community is looking for with this standard, and basically, you know, how often they want to be reviewing these kinds of requests.
Catherine, while we're talking about the trees on sites, I don't know if you all have noticed, but I think it's 8.12.2 in the supplementary regulations. There is a requirement that where a building site for a dwelling unit is devoid of trees, 3 trees shall be planted for every 1,000 square feet of living space, and that they shall be planted within 100 feet of the exterior of the principal structure. So I don't know that everyone's familiar with that, but just given that we're talking about who would plant trees and who wouldn't plant trees, there is an existing requirement in the Springhill Zoning Regulation where apparently they contemplated back in the day that if there are no trees on the site and someone builds a dwelling unit, they need to plant trees.
Yeah, thanks so much for bringing that up, Jessen.
Justin, we certainly are aware of that requirement at the staff level, and that comes up during our land use permit review. Not just in Springhill, but in many of our zoning districts have some sort of provision, for example, about, you know, planting boulevard trees, things like that. The unfortunate reality is a lot of times, you know, we can notify people of that requirement, but we're not going back out to verify that they have been planted. And even when people do plant them per the requirement, irrigating and maintaining those trees is not something we're equipped to monitor over time. And so unfortunately, what I'm saying is it's not really a meaningful provision, you know, absent something like a conditional use permit that really, I think, ties it and elevates the importance of that sort of thing that an applicant is agreeing to in the long term as a condition of approval. So it's a challenge.
I would like to add one quick comment and pick up what actually Randy had just messaged. If you do a very separate little models using the current definition, 24 foot, but then with that's just so-called median of the gable roof, for example, you know, you end up, that can be gamed, and that's one of the problems. If, as she put it, you limit up to 35 foot and require mitigation of visual impact, that turns it to where you're incentivizing, even if it's not a CUP requirement. I'm not sure how this works, that to make it work smoothly. But just let's, for example, 35 foot is a height that includes probably every existing non-agricultural building in the district. And that's a significant height. That's essentially effectively a 3-story building with a 1-4 roof. If you have a standard width of, say, I don't know, I'd have to do it on paper, but say 40-foot width. The key thing will be is to specify this is measured from the top point of the roof, or rather from the finished grade at the front of the building as stated now to the top point of the structure. And it also must address the issue of excavation changing the finished grade. Thank you, Randy.
So is anybody, thanks, Phil. And is anybody unable to read the chat? Because some conversations have been happening there, and we can read that out loud if it would be helpful for folks to get caught up. I'm not hearing
Chats are
any.
showing up fine for me.
Okay, excellent. Fantastic. Good. We're all in step. So it sounds, would it be helpful for the purposes of the discussion to look at the, proposed definitions of building height and grade now that we've thought a little bit more about this issue of whether to stick with using the wooded site versus non-wooded site standard for height versus potentially having this other permitting avenue? Would that help people's thinking on this issue?
But
That's what
before
I
we-
was hearing from
Yeah.
Phil's comment.
Before we leave this though, I mean, what are you thinking about these definitions? I mean, have they simplified and clarified things, or have they just, made it as confusing as it's always been? I mean, I don't know that we have a consensus about where we are with this before we move on.
Sure.
I mean, frankly, what's the point? At this point, if you use a standard 35-foot height, that's it from finished grade at the front of the building to the topmost point on the structure. I don't know there's much point in going into wooded site, non-wooded site.
I agree.
I mean, it's an interesting historical reference, but I think you could, and maybe it needs, I would say we should think about this a bit more insofar as what are the issues of mitigation that may be applied to, and again, I think it's a work in progress. We're,
Yeah.
thinking off the top of our head.
But
Because
I
if you
think
do
that-
have a 35-foot structure, you
That
may
point is-
want to have some
Yeah.
key guidelines for mitigation of the, thank you.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point about mitigating whatever the height is, so that that it's not going to tower over everything around it. But one of the questions that came out of the chat was, what are the height of all the existing, the average height of all the existing houses out there now? I mean, just to put it into a point of reference. So has anyone done a calculation on what the average height of the roofs are out there now?
I've done an estimate on some of them. Actually, I don't know, for instance, the Bill Wright's house is a good example. I think it's under 28 feet, but Randy, can you correct me on that?
Randy put into the chat, Bill Wright said it was over 28 feet.
Okay. Yeah. I suppose we could do some sample of some of the older buildings. I honestly,
Yeah, I think that's a fair idea. I mean, because Bill's place doesn't look overly imposing. I mean, in terms of height, I'm surprised it's over 28, maybe 30 feet. But
yeah,
that's a good
I don't know. The only thing I used was a small, it's a device that you can use from the street, but I tried to look at a few places, but anyway, whatever.
So it sounds like maybe a little bit more thinking needs to happen and some research about what if we move forward with a sort of flat height standard, what would be, appropriate, and what I think, as Randy said, would not turn this into an HOA.
Yeah,
Right.
It sounds like, I mean, there's games that can be played with the grade and these definitions. So I think we need to make sure there's no games that can be played. Getting a frame of reference, Anna made the point, I think, with Bill Wright's place and some of the older farmhouses, they don't look overly imposing. We're trying to avoid McMansions, right? I mean, and so I don't know if it's 30 feet or 35 feet, but we could look at that as a frame of reference. We need to make sure those definitions are rock solid so there can be no gamesmanship. And I think that's one of the areas where, again, Phil deferred to some of his perspective. And then that could work. I guess the only other question is, as it relates to being deferential to the topography, right? We've had things in the guidelines before about not building on a ridge line and things that have been ignored or maybe not even known, and so people built where they built. So, you know, going back to the variance and the conditional use, I don't know how we can define that. And the more we can define, this goes back to Phil Olson's point, which I think is great, right? Collectively, we want to define this as clearly as possible to avoid friction. You know, friction in the neighborhood, which, you know, rather than a sense of community. And so if there are things that can define what deferential, based upon your experience with other Part 1 zones, what deferential to topography or sensitive to the environment means in terms of breaking up that roof line or being below the ridge line, you know, maybe we can parameterize it that way. And the combination of those things puts us in a position where, you know, Randy's arguing for simplification. I think we're all in favor of that. If we've got it proper parameters that are easy enough to interpret, right?
Yeah, and I appreciate that, Jeff. And I think that brings us back to the question of, you know, what really is the goal of what was the goal of this standard, right? And it sounds like there's this idea of an imposing building or opposing structure that you're sort of not aiming for. And one way to create that is through a height regulation. And like you said, Jeff, another way to create it is through standards for ridge lines. And we have those in Gallatin Canyon, Big Sky, and in Bridger Canyon. So we have examples of those. I think Bridger Canyon very recently adopted those kinds of like ridgeline and hillside standards in their most recent update. Sean, I don't have a really good sense of how well they work, but we have them.
They're new in Bridger Canyon, so there's been some language, but I think it's been updated and revised and a little bit been bolstered. Big Sky, you know, what has worked well is it talks about you know, ridge lines from very specific roadways. So the main road, the spur road, for example, is one of the roads that's listed there. So you can't have a building that skylines as viewed from that road. And so naming those specific roadways is very helpful. That's something that we can work with as planning staff. What it doesn't do is guarantee that, you know, a structure doesn't skyline from, you know, all other properties in the Big Sky zoning district. So, you know, there's not, as far as I'm aware, really an ironclad way to fix that. But, you know, mapping some of the, unlike vegetation, which might change over time, the topography really shouldn't change too much. You know, mapping some of those prominent ridge lines in the Spring Hill district could be very helpful, for example.
Mm-hmm. And I want to thank you, Sean, and I want to jump in with a comment that Randy put into the chat, saying people build on high ground because they get best views. If they buy and own the land, they should be able to build where they want. Lots of houses have been built on high points. Let's see, Nancy and Regan agreed. And then Phil said there are many homes. Woo, the chat is blown up so fast I can't even keep up. Let's see. Phil says there are many homes that are built off ridge, e.g. walkout. And Jeff says, I'm only referencing the original guidelines which explicitly talked about avoiding ridge lines. Let's see, whomever is Galaxy S21 5G says ditto Randy. And Nancy added, there's one or two in my view, but I don't own the land, they do. So it sounds like they're pretty diverging perspectives on this. And I guess I wanna, when thinking about this, I wanna highlight something that Sean said about how ridgeline standards work in Gallatin Canyon, Big Sky, and actually in the Bridger Canyon zoning regulations, is that those ridgeline standards are focused on protecting specific views from specific roadways. So if there's an iconic view in Springhill that everyone says, yeah, let's keep buildings off of ridgelines here, there might be a way to write a standard that addresses that. But I'm not necessarily hearing from the group that folks want to try and implement ridgeline standards all over the place.
Yeah, my only point is that they already exist. That doesn't mean that people have used them to guide their building decisions and their site location decisions. But when this was put together back almost 30 years ago by this visionary group, they did address that with the notion that, you know, lots of beautiful homes, but you're probably not buying here to see your neighbor's home. You're buying here to see the surrounding scenery. So again, this is where we kind of straddle the fence between, are we trying to preserve something, right, and just fortify it in terms of clarity, or are we trying to change it?
Yeah, thanks for that comment, Jeff.
Yeah, hi, it's Rich Harges here. And I have a comment on this for sure. I think, imagine if you come here to Spring Hill community and you buy, and it's expensive to buy, and you buy and you put your house in an average place or in a hollow, or you follow the old rules. And then let's just imagine 5-10 years later, somebody sells the land next door to you, and on the highest ridge line overlooking your property, someone decides to build a house. That house now dominates your view shed where it didn't when you built. So the money you spent building, the money you spent buying, has now not been spent in the way you thought, but rather your view is now compromised. So when we say that you should be able to build wherever you like, I think you have to realize that some of us bought here specifically because of the old guidelines. We bought here liking what those guidelines meant. And in fact, we were right. I mean, those guidelines have created a tremendous amount of wealth here. I don't think you want to take those away willy-nilly. Like, I would definitely not want someone to, for whatever, view sheds I had, take them away in the future. So whatever standard we adopt now, I believe has to be incredibly sensitive to the standards that we all bought under when we spent our money. Otherwise, in taking something away, that loss, that deadweight loss, I think is pretty bad, or at least for me, it would feel pretty bad. And so I think there are ridge lines that are important. And I think building on the highest part of your property affects those adjacent properties in fundamental and monetary ways. That's my opinion about that.
I have to disagree somewhat in that people buy the property, it's their property, and they should have the ability to do with it what they wish to. To say that you need, if you want to protect your view, you have the right, the opportunity to buy that property to protect your view. And that gives you the property rights, just like the property rights of someone who buys it belongs to the person who bought it.
Yeah, I guess that's not my point. My point, it's true if the land comes for sale, certainly. And I'm definitely a markets oriented person, so I get what you're saying there and agree with it, actually. But that's not what I'm saying, actually. What I'm saying is those of us who already made those decisions in accordance with the old rules, I don't want to see those values taken away. And it doesn't matter that property comes for sale or doesn't come for sale. My adjacent neighbors could decide to build on the ridge lines around my property, and I suddenly would see their houses and not Ross Peak. And that is exactly what would happen in certain locations. And I would not want that ability. And currently in Springhill zoning, there are prohibitions against that. And I would like that we continue to follow those. That's what I'm saying. And that doesn't mean, you know, that has nothing to say about whether land was for sale or not. Just where can you build?
Okay, I'm getting what you're saying, I think, but I think the ordinance regulations now, as they're called, do cover that.
Well, Bruce, I think that's the point. They do cover it. And I think we're just saying that the reason we've seen such tremendous property appreciation, and we have, you know, this incredibly scenic, coveted area in which we're privileged to learn, is because there were limitations on development. There were limitations on sizing. There were limitations on where you'd built. Now, again, they haven't been adhered to, and we're not trying to make this an HOA. We are way, way away from an HOA, because obviously quite a few of us probably have experience, and not great experience with an HOA. It's just parameters that have preserved value and will continue to do so. And so Rich's point is about, for those who've adhered to it, I've got a much higher ground on my property that wasn't built on, right? You know, we need folks to, I mean, that's what people bought into when this ordinance was put into place, at least those recent property owners. So, you know, we're trying to establish guidelines to preserve the value and appreciation that has occurred to date, and based upon the original ordinance.
Yeah, Bruce,
I-
I'm trying to be super delicate about it, but you know, I mean, there have been buildings constructed on adjacent properties to mine, and they've taken away whole view sheds because they were built right on ridge lines. And I don't want to see that happen anymore, to the extent that it doesn't need to. I'm pretty sensitive to it because I feel like I've lost quite a lot already.
So by making the current regulations more restrictive, that won't ever happen because they obviously didn't adhere to the regulations or ordinances it was.
Yeah, I'm not sure, honestly. I'm pretty pessimistic about it, to be sure. But I think that by going back to what was originally written, at least we're all going back to what we bought into, you know? I mean, I think the market will speak, and I get what you're saying. And if I get what you're saying, and if I have an opportunity to buy and I don't buy, I guess I should shut up about it. But I don't want to see certain ridge lines built on, and there should be a way to enforce that thinking that's already in the current guidelines.
I agree with you, and I'm just comfortable with the current regulations.
Sounds like everyone needs, I mean, maybe there's a suggestion here, being mindful of time, as we're sitting at 8:33 and we still have a few items to go through. Maybe everyone who should have a copy of the original guidelines, right? You got this issue, there's this prospect of maximum height. We have the original guidelines, which were, you know, and as Randy's just reiterated, we're not trying to change those. And Bruce, you're saying we're not trying to change those, but we do want to make sure that people adhere to those, right? And there's been drift in the past. So how do you hold people accountable as neighbors who have, you know, something to lose? Maybe that goes back to this variance process where there's visibility in the neighborhood in terms of what someone's trying to do. Again, I don't have any artful approach to this notion of being sensitive to the topography, but you know, there's probably some value in some folks brainstorming a little bit around that. I do think we still need to knock down grade and make sure there's no gamesmanship outside of this building height, because then maybe we can go to that simpler principle and focus on between people reading the original guidelines, or sorry, design guide, and then this notion of, you know, defining topographical environmental sensitivity. Maybe we can find some middle ground here. But it feels like we're running in circles right now.
Yeah, I think you're right. Maybe the first thing to do is to focus on grade and then go back and address height.
If I could
Yeah.
just add a point of clarification, for those people who may not know why the discussion of wooded site and non-wooded site and building height came up, it was because there was a CUP meeting months ago, and one of the county commissioners pointed out that he didn't understand necessarily the images related to wooded site and non-wooded site. I think he characterized them as being like a coloring book or something. And
Yes.
so thank you, Catherine. And so the intention was to add clarity, not to change anything, but just to provide clarity so that the planning and zoning commissioners, when they're using these regulations, actually can use them more effectively. So just for those people who didn't understand that, I don't think there was any intention to make any radical changes. It was just to, again, provide language that was a little more clear from a application standpoint for the actual planning and zoning commission that has to use these regulations when decisions come in front of them.
Great.
I'd like
Thank
to-
you, Jessen.
I'm sorry.
Oh, go
Catherine,
ahead.
may I make a comment? Oh, okay.
Go
I
ahead,
think that the big picture on this is the wooded versus non-wooded was really to address mitigating a tall building. Think about it that way, Bruce. I think that's a fair way to see it. I realized that was talk about, okay, the height definitions as they're now written. Unfortunately, we've realized 30 years ago, 30 years ago, people talk, I think it was plain and it was understood. What's happened is there's been some episodes of gaming the system that actually got by planning staff even. And I think, why is that? Because the current formulas, depending on type of roof, the using which eave, unfortunately lent itself to abuse. And I think come around as in line of what Randy pointed out, or as Catherine presented, to look at height, maybe 28 feet, and then some conditions to go to 35. The idea is to keep really entirely with the 30-year-old guidelines. And it does protect, the idea is to protect one another's values. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to move us to the next slide here in a moment, but I want to present two additional pieces of information, one from the zoning regulation and then one from the chat from Randy. Just some more food for thought as you all keep thinking about this. So in section 7 pertaining to development rights, there are under section 7.5 in the existing Springhill Zoning Regulation and from the Springhill Zoning Ordinance, building site design standards. And there are two provisions under that section, provisions D and E, saying the building site is located with the least disturbance to the natural topography, landscape, and vegetation. And the building site location avoids exposed hillsides, ridge tops, and creek banks. And these are standards that would apply, if people were using basically an extra or transferred development right. So if they were building something special essentially on their property or something that not everybody would automatically have, then these standards would come into effect and have been in the Springhill Zoning Regulation since it was the Springhill Zoning Ordinance. So I just want to make folks aware of that in case that is something they want to consider in the general design standards, or as if you're thinking about going the route of, a conditional use permit or a variance. we already have that language in the regulation to address some of the issues that we've been talking about. And Randy offered another suggestion, is that she pointed out that you all have the opportunity to form a zoning advisory committee, not just the Springhill Alliance, but the community in general. And I know that this has been a topic of conversation, but that zoning advisory committee would be able to make a recommendation to the Planning and Zoning Commission on, you know, quasi-judicial matters like variances and conditional use permits that or other items that come before them. So that's another way to, you know, provide a voice to the Springhill community in these matters. You can form this advisory committee and make an official recommendation on different projects. And that's another way to sort of address and capture the complexity that is present in any community and is certainly present in this community when it comes to issues of property rights and community benefit and things of that nature. So I just wanted to bring those points to the front and encourage you all to keep thinking about this issue. And I'm gonna take us to the next slide related to, where is it? I seem to be missing my slide on height. Oh, here we go, sorry. You all, the Springhill Alliance's memo proposed some definitions of building height and grade, and they are very similar to what the planning department would recommend, which is actually definitions pioneered in the Donuts, aka the Gallatin County Bozeman area zoning district, and is currently used in the Bridger Canyon zoning regulations. And we have just heard from staff members who all of our staff members strongly prefer the Donuts definitions for building height and grade for their clarity and usability. And so I've put those on the right-hand side of the screen. The grade definition in particular is very similar to the one that was proposed. There's actually additional provisions of the donut regulations building height definition that we could add in if you think you would like to use them. One of them has to do with the grade of the site. So there's a formula that it provides if somebody is building on a slope. So that helps us determine the height of the building and sort of how to measure it if they're building on a slope. So we can add that in if that's of interest to folks. But we just wanted to present our definitions or definitions that the planning department thinks are working well and are used in other districts presently. And I'm happy to read out the part about the grade aloud if that would be helpful.
There's a typo in the proposed by Springhill Alliance. I think that fourth sentence down on grade should be determined from the natural grade instead of form.
Oh, good catch.
But that's a nice distinction that's in the proposal by the Alliance that's not in the one by the Planning Department with regards to the natural grade.
Hey, it's Rich again. Can someone address, please, the one proposed by, oh, this is proposed by Springhill Alliance. Jeff, maybe you can get this, or maybe Phil Sakosha, because I know you've both been involved. This is your new proposal for Springhill Alliance. In other words, this is the one that does away with the sort of the funky building height provision that exists today that allowed for our recent legal soiree where we, where we found that a 55-foot building could actually be classified as a 33-foot building by the original Spring Hill language. Is that correct? And this new language here proposed by Spring Hill Alliance is what purportedly cures that. Is that correct?
That is correct. And the grade issue here, I mean, the reason the kind of natural grade is referenced is because there was a lot of earth moving and manufacturing of a grade that again created a window of opportunity to stretch the parameters. I mean, it got stress tested. It was pretty good, but we discovered a lot of holes in it, and this tries to close those holes, completely consistent again with the original intent. I mean, that's what we believe. Phil, you may want to comment.
I really only just would emphasize that the proposal that is both building height and grade that is submitted by Spring Hill Alliance addresses both the discussion and concerns of previous commission meetings, and it does go to the heart of it to make sure that these definitions are not scammed.
One challenge I see with the proposed definition of grade by the Alliance that I've dealt with similar proposals in other districts or definitions in other districts is I like the concept of the undisturbed grade and the natural grade. We do have situations where people, I mean, essentially what you're saying is someone's going to be required to have a survey done of the property before the elevations of the property before they can proceed. And so what happens when that doesn't occur? What happens when someone doesn't get the required land use permit before they start construction and there's no way to go back and reliably construct the natural grade? We're really stuck in that situation at an impasse, and I don't really know how to get through that in a way that's fair to everybody. And so that's one of the things that is removed from the picture in the definition that's proposed by the planning department. We're looking at the finished surface of the ground. The lowest point is the finished surface of the ground.
On my feet.
You've obviously have the experience of dealing with administrative issues that none of us have. I think that the intent would seem that when someone comes in with a building permit for any structure, there could be basic inspection of whether or not the ground has been turned into a hill or some other significant alteration. I don't think any of us intended, as we understand it, to require a survey.
So Sean, that again, as Phil said, you guys have experience in terms of how to hold people accountable, and that sounds really cumbersome to have topographical, a true topographical survey done, although you can do that with, I guess, a laser scan pretty easily these days. But so how have you seen, this concept of manufacturing grade and manipulating, the natural topography? I mean, how have you managed that or seen that managed in these other zones? Just neighbors keeping an eye on it?
I mean, not very effectively is really the answer. I don't know that anyone has really nailed that down, in a way that has a whole lot of integrity. that's the intent of, you know, the natural grade component, as I understand it, in your proposed definition, and I think the definition that exists in, I think, Hebgen Lake, for example, and Bridger Canyon. You know, I just want to point out there's really some challenges in administering it when things do go sideways. You know, we hope that people go through the proper process and we try and inform them of it, but there are situations where it doesn't happen that way, and something like this can make it very difficult because there's really not an ironclad way for someone to go back and recreate what the natural grade was in some circumstances. So unfortunately, you know, I don't have a great answer for you, Jeff, but that is sort of the basis and the rationale for why we're pointing to this other suggested definition. Do you have anything to add, Catherine?
No, I think that summarizes it.
So Sean, are you referring specifically to structures that are built without a permit, that just go in there and bulldoze and stick up a building without going through the process?
Yes. And it could be a situation where someone does obtain a land use permit, and a neighbor, let's look at it from the standpoint of a neighbor questions whether grade was determined properly. I think the only way to protect the applicant is for the applicant to have done a topographic survey of the natural grade. So, you know, that does add some expense to the building process.
Now, does the permit process include an on-site inspection by the county?
It does include an on-site inspection. The on-site inspection is, you know, they've got the proposed footprint of the structure staked, and we're coming out to look at primarily setbacks from property lines, from easements, from water courses, irrigation ditches, things like that. The plans that are submitted as part of the land use permit, you know, will have to show what natural grade is. And again, I think the only reliable way to do that would withstand a challenge from a neighbor is probably to have it surveyed. So.
Excuse me. Generally, I'm new to this, but generally, isn't the burden on the individual who is trying to develop the property to show that he or she complies with all of the requirements? So I don't understand why it's such a burden to show that they complied with this grade requirement.
Correct. So an applicant is required to demonstrate that their proposed project meets the requirements of the regulation. And an applicant can do that and show us the grade in a variety of different ways. If you as the neighbor question what was provided and what was proposed, I think the credibility of that information would be called into question. And so what I'm saying is, I think in reality, for it to withstand that challenge that could arise, you know, you're talking about the cost of a topographic survey being added to land use permits for any structure that's built on any type of slope. And
I understand that.
I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. You can't do that, but I want you to be aware that that is the consequence of that language.
But do you think that is less specific than the planning department suggestions? In other words, if you're talking about who can game the system, if you say we want to know what the natural grade was before you started, and you have the burden to show us what that natural grade was. It seems to me that is a much more specific and easily understood requirement than the finished surface of the ground, which shall not include window wells, stairwells, blah, 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 as in the planning department suggestion. So I don't understand if we're trying to avoid ambiguity, why we wouldn't just look at the finished surface of the ground prior to development.
So, I mean, just another example of a potential challenge with the natural grade issue is, you know, let's say someone excavated into a hillside 30 years ago.
Yeah.
But what do you think is more subject to abuse and finagling?
I think there's
The
pros and
natural
cons.
surface or the finished surface?
I think there's pros and cons of both options. I think the option that the planning department proposed is one that we're better equipped to administer.
I would agree, or at least that's what I've heard
That's not,
from.
it may be better, you may be better equipped to administer it, but is it the less ambiguous?
Well, I think
Is it what we're trying to achieve? Maybe I shouldn't say less ambiguous. Is it less subject to manipulation than the planning department suggestion? Maybe
sure.
harder to administer, but less subject to manipulation.
Sure. And I think Sean was sort of trying to describe the link between administrative, like how something is administered, and the ability of folks to manipulate a regulation. And I guess I just want to sort of describe what the process is for planning department staff when they go out to do a site visit on a land use permit. So they've received a bunch of sets of plans and hopefully any necessary septic permits or things of that nature. They have elevations of all four sides of the building. They have a site plan showing setbacks, topography, that kind of thing. And then they ask the applicant to stake out their site. And folks are allowed to do dirt work. They do any kind of activity at their own risk, but they are allowed to do it. And so sometimes the planning department will go out to a site, and it's not just a big, grassy field or a clearing in the woods or something. It's, a flattened area carved out of a hillside where, because otherwise the natural grade is so steep that they wouldn't be able to stake the building accurately without creating a flat site. And so it's not like the planning department would show up in that instance and say, I can see clearly the natural grade. The natural grade at that point is long gone. It's a pile of dirt and, however many stakes are necessary to represent the corners of the structure. So I can just see that being very difficult for us to field verify, and maybe not even providing, meaningful information through that field verification process. Whereas, with things like setbacks, that is something we can verify in the field because we ask property owners to stake their property corners too, so we can measure. So I think in that way, administration, our role in going out and not only looking at plans, but in field verifying becomes really important in, the actual efficacy of the regulation. So I think that's why it's not because we're trying to undermine the intent, which I think we understand and empathize with, but we do know that this pair of definitions, building height and grade from the donut and that are now in use in Bridger Canyon, are things that our staff feel like have been tested and work well. So that's a big part of why we're recommending them, is because we do see that link between between administration and these regulations holding up. And I guess one other thing that, one other situation that comes to mind as an example is of just how contested some of these issues can be is, we'll have setback, we'll have somebody who their neighbor claims was built into a setback, and they'll have, competing surveys done, or somebody will have tried to do a survey on their neighbor's property. And I think really that could be extraordinarily difficult in this situation. And I think that was the situation that, I think that's what Sean was trying to highlight, is that, if somebody contests information that the applicant provided, or that the planning department, and that the planning department then field verified, it can be extremely difficult to then go back and try and measure or determine exactly what was going on, particularly in this situation with grade. Sean, do you have any other comments?
Well, Catherine and Sean, the nut of the problem is that just even within this last year, someone had basically proposed to build a 12-foot hill in order to increase the height of the building that was going to be built, and then went through review. I mean, we're trying to address what amounts to be something that hasn't, I guess, 30 years ago, maybe people, things have changed clearly, and there's more aggressive behavior by some people. And I don't know, all I'm telling you is that you need to address what would be artificial change in grade. And if you've got, you're talking about that donut language. I mean, that's dated. No one's probably changed it or challenged it, but how do you address someone building a hill to then increase the height of their building?
I think, certainly there's an improvement by getting rid of the concept of the front of the building, which, as Phil knows, was also an issue in the matter he's referring to. And to me, it's a little bit like, okay, who bears the burden of showing compliance with the spirit of the regulations? And I realize it may make it more difficult for you to establish what was the finished surface of the ground beforehand. But on the other hand, it's the burden of the individual who is trying to build a structure to show that he or she has complied with that requirement. And if they can't show it, then they can't build it. Seems fairly straightforward to me. And those of us in Springhill have experienced exactly what Phil is talking about. With equipment that is available today that maybe wasn't available in 30 years ago, you can move a lot of earth and change the surface of the ground in amazing ways. And by the way, I am not Kate Kraserick, that's my daughter-in-law, who spends way more time on Zoom than I do. I'm Walt Smith.
Hey, it's Rich again. I absolutely agree with Walter. I think it's a burden of proof kind of a thing. I've tried now, or just listening to everybody. So this is just my personal opinion, and where I would come down if asked on this is that it should be the responsibility of the applicant to demonstrate grade relative to natural grade, because while it's true, and Randy actually, one of her comments before really resonated with me. She asked, didn't we actually defeat that CUP? And it's true, Randy, we did. It was super costly and in both terms of time and dollars. And so I think that if every single time a challenge like that comes up and we use modern methods And then if the populace here, if the people who are in Spring Hill now have to foot the bill to defeat it, you know, I think the planning department was well on its way to approve that project. And it almost got approved, you know, and it was hard to defeat due to these, you know, problems. So I think Walter's right. I think that it comes down to which entity should have to bear the proof. And it seems to me it should be the applicant's responsibility to prove in cases that are that bear that expense, right? I mean, obviously, if there's, you know, if it's flat ground and you're not building mounds and you're not showing that sort of thing, maybe that's not an issue. But in the case that we're all talking about, there was a massive amount of manipulation involved. And we had to defeat those points one by one.
So I have another question for Sean and Catherine. And you know, you've heard tonight concern expressed about ridge line development and impairment of view share and things like that. What does the county planning department do now with regards to location of building envelopes on property to try to minimize that from happening?
I think it depends on the type of project that's being reviewed. You know, right now in Spring Hill, you have, you know, some property line setbacks and various other standards, but, you know, my understanding, aside from the, I'm talking about someone just building on an existing tract of land using the primary development right that exists. The language about, you know, avoiding ridge lines and other sensitive concepts is in the design manual, which isn't regulatory. If someone is going through a conditional use permit to use the additional development right or a transferred development right, you know, there's other considerations, as we discussed earlier, that come into play for where those building sites are located. If someone's going through the subdivision review process, you know, that's subject to public comment and other criteria, you know, there's a lot of other factors that can come into play about, you know, where building sites are located. So it really depends on the process that someone is subject to.
But in our case, there's no specific language about the locating building envelopes on property within Spring Hill.
There are when it comes to using the additional development rights or transferred development rights. But just for an existing tract of land and someone wanting to use the primary development right that exists on that, you know, there's property line setbacks, I think setbacks from creeks and some ditches, things like that. But no, nothing besides that I'm aware of.
I'm going to read out a request that Randy just put into the chat. She says, can we end this meeting and take it up on a different date? This discussion has been great and lots of things for people to think about. As Jeff said, we need to be sensitive to time, and it is after 9 at this point. So I appreciate her checking in about that. What do you all think about that? I think if we ended the meeting tonight, Sean, you can tell me if I'm wrong about this, but I think it would be very, very, very difficult for us to put together a draft of complete and draft of amendments to the Springhill Zoning Regulation that would be satisfactory to everyone to go on the Planning and Zoning Commission's agenda for October. So I just want to acknowledge that. And I also want to acknowledge that we have quite a few more issues to get through. And I'm hearing quite a bit of quite a number of differing perspectives on issues like just if there's going to be a single height standard, things like whether a conditional use permit or a variance would be of interest to folks, rather than having the wooded versus non-wooded site and all the sort of accessory definitions. We've had a new issue come up about ridgeline standards and questions about that. And now we're having this discussion about sort of how to address grade. So, and it also sounds like there was a conversation in chat about whether or not to form a zoning advisory committee and what that would mean, and open meeting laws and things of that nature. So frankly, what I'm hearing is that we are not ready to move forward and push this through to October, and that there needs to be a lot more discussion with the community, and hopefully we can reconvene and talk more about these issues and address some of the other big ones that we were hoping to get to tonight. So how are folks feeling about that? What are thoughts on that?
I'll just, before anyone else answers, I'm in agreement with Catherine's suggestion and her observations. And I think Jeff commented earlier that, the Alliance and community members have been starting to work on their zoning regulation for close to 18 months at this point. I know you all want to see it resolved and move on with your lives. I don't think you want to live and breathe zoning, but I appreciate everyone's participation in these discussions and the thoughtfulness with which these issues are being discussed. But I don't think rushing to the finish line benefits anyone. I think having the thorough discussions and making sure that people are comfortable with the content before we proceed is the right way to go.
Yeah,
So
and if we do propose something new that the planning department hasn't tried before, I think it would be wise if we had an opportunity, Sean and I, to take it back and workshop it with the rest of the staff to make sure that it would do what we are hoping it would do. So that would also hopefully be another part of the process if we are going to propose something new. So I just want to add that in there as.
I think there are a lot of excellent points raised, and is someone going to summarize what came out of this call so that we can identify these issues, so that we can continue to work on them, so we don't have to keep having, these circular discussions where we just keep talking about the same stuff, but we're not able to move to resolution. Is someone going to summarize the key points from this Zoom call this evening?
Phil, do you want to take a stab at it?
Is that Phil Sakosha?
I thought a Phil was talking right now. Is that?
It's Phil Olson.
I think
Well,
your
Olson.
suggestion is I think Phil Sakosha would be ideal. I vote for him. I think that's a wonderful idea.
Well, no, I mean, I think that's a good exercise.
No, we do need to do it.
If somebody wants to summarize briefly for the group what we heard today, and have that on the video record, I think that could be really valuable. And then send a follow-up email. So does anyone want to take a stab at that summary?
I vote for Phil Sakosha as
Pop
well.
quiz at 9:15.
I would ask Jessen to do it if she's still on as short form, just because trying to keep it, with someone who is a wordsmith. But anyway, whatever, we do need to do this.
Is there a way to get the recording? So I know it's being recorded. Is there a way to throw that in a Dropbox somewhere? So
Yeah,
that whoever does this can at least have the benefit of the verbal?
Yeah. So yeah, it will be on the Gallatin County Planning or Gallatin County's YouTube channel, which you may or may not have known we have. I'll be able to get that up Thursday or Friday, depending. And yeah, folks will be able to watch it as many times as they want for reference. My recommendation would be that we designate somebody now to do the summarizing, so that gets done. And I would recommend somebody who's on the call, not somebody who has to watch the video after the fact.
Yeah. So do you by chance have voice translation software that translates the audio into written form?
We do not.
No, but I think this could probably be summarized in a few bullet points. And the reason why I'm asking the group to do this is because I want to make sure that it represents the group's understanding of this meeting and not mine.
Yeah. Well, I think that hopefully some of us were taking good notes. I think we can come up with that document. I think Phil can take a whack, and Randy's offered to help. And, I think that we can circulate that, and we can get a document, I think, that would have the key issues that have been raised. And so at least we can focus on, working towards resolution.
Great. And I'm happy, Randy, thank you for volunteering that, and other folks who are going to help with that. That's great. And I'd be happy to take a look at it too. And help distribute it as well. So, all right, I think we have a plan.
And I'll be willing to work with Randy with it too.
Yeah, let me make a comment here if you don't mind. I mean, I appreciate, again, Sean and Catherine, you joining, and everyone who's participated. I think one thing that is clear, again, is we've got a pretty remarkable document that's almost 30 years old. We're trying to adhere to that as much as possible because it has stood the test of time, but improve clarity where practical, where it's been stress tested and we've identified holes, which happens with any document over time. We need to fix those holes. A group grope is not going to work. We can sit and circle around these issues, and everyone needs to be heard. So that's important, and we can make the time to do that. But, and I don't know if we have even the time to kind of go through quickly the remaining issues you've identified, Catherine, or if you can at least circulate this, because practically speaking, I don't like the idea at all of extending the time frame. We can't rush, but we haven't rushed. We've been at it for 18 months. But maybe that's where we're at. But we need to have specific groups, engagement from folks who are going to then, again, trying to thread a needle. There is no way we will make everyone happy here. And trying to create something that's practical for you all to enforce, but that preserves what we've bought into, what we've been living with, fortunate to live with, whatever case is in terms of your tenure here in Springhill. But we can summarize this. We need to come out with a very specific plan with specific engagement from individuals within the community on these initiatives that are going to put forth a recommendation, because I think we can do this again and again, and we will continue to push out, resolution or end game in terms of fortifying the Springhill regulations or preserving the Springhill regulations relative to the addition of the administrative regs. So we got to stay focused on what that mandate is here and develop a practical short-term path to get there. It's a statement of the obvious for everyone, but I appreciate everyone's engagement. But when we come to you with specific requests to provide input, we're going to need it, and we're going to need it on a timely basis to get this done. I'll get off my soapbox.
Thanks, Jeff. And yeah, I think just something for the notes is that, we have this specific set of issues that brought the group together, which are, building height and grade, this issue of wooded versus non-wooded. accessory uses and structures or buildings, the administrative stuff that we touched on already, and some other changes. And we've identified some other ones. And so something you all might consider, like this ridgeline standard, is whether the ridgeline issue needs to be addressed as part of the discussion about height, or whether that is something separate that would come later and requires more thought and consideration, for example. It's like either some of these things may be directly pertinent to these issues that everybody agrees, or more or less, it sounds like there's some agreement that some of these issues need to be addressed. And then there are some other issues that have arisen that maybe we need to address, or maybe need to be put out to pasture for a while and have everybody ruminate on. Sorry for the livestock references. I couldn't help myself. So I just want to have you all thinking about that too. Just because something came up in tonight's meeting doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be addressed right away with this suite of amendments. It may, but you may find that, okay, we don't have to address it immediately and we need to give this more thought. So that's for your consideration as well, to Jeff's point.
I have a question. The video will be available. Will the texts that were submitted also be available?
Yeah, we will save those, the text conversation, and I will figure out somewhere to put it and send you all a link.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Bruce. And it sounds like it would be useful for, would it be useful for me to just send out this PowerPoint to everybody? And so you could see some of the other stuff we were hoping to talk about?
Yes.
I think it would be that way if we can just kind of assign for related issues, kind of task teams, focus on engagement with the community and making a specific recommendation. I think that'd be helpful, Kathy.
Great. And I'll try and make sure that
Thank
the slides are detailed enough without audio commentary that you know what's going on. All right. Any other tasks to assign or plans to make before we sign off? Should we think about when we might convene again to talk about all of this? Or is that something you all need to discuss further?
Can you give us a couple of time blocks? I would say that our experience, even in this last month where we had momentum, had a finish line in mind. So people are busy traveling while they could, but, we kind of lost momentum. And so I would suggest we try to maintain a cadence and see if we can reconvene next week, or at least no later than the following week to make progress here. And while people are fresh in terms of some of the discussion, just based upon what we saw kind of happen with the lack of input with this last round of documents.
Folks, next Wednesday?
I'm going to be the naysayer and say it's going to be hard for me to meet before the week of October 11th. But if you're up for it, Catherine, you're certainly welcome to continue the discussions. You're doing a fantastic job.
Well, fantastic might be an overstatement, but we're meeting tonight, so that's a win. Other folks on the call next Wednesday, would that be next Wednesday, September 29th, 7 p.m., I would assume? Would that work for folks? Should we pencil that in?
Yeah.
Go ahead and pencil it in.
Yeah. That'll give us that'll give us everybody something to push against. We ought to try to have all of our comments into Randy and Phil Sakosha by by Friday so that we can get the document prepared and circulated so that we'd have the ability to move forward on Wednesday. But does that make sense?
Oh, the notes from tonight's meeting,
For,
is that?
yeah, for for those, we need to prepare a document summarizing the points that have been raised tonight, and so that we've got a roadmap to kind of move forward. But I'm just saying, I think Randy and Phil Sakosha agreed to help to draft that. So just saying, anybody that wants to provide input should get it to them no later than Friday, so that they have time to prepare it. We have circulated before a call next Wednesday.
One, just to be clear, it's going to take us maybe until Friday to get the recording up on the county's YouTube channel. Unfortunately, Catherine and I are reliant on a county employee who's in a different department to do that for us. So we can beg her to do it tomorrow, but it might take till Friday.
Yeah, thanks for noting that, Sean. Okay, so it sounds like we all have homework and we're all gonna get together. I'm thinking, sounds like via Zoom, sounds like that worked reasonably well, barring any interventions from Mother Nature or otherwise, to meet next week and summarize what we've talked about thus far, and if any progress has been made on what we talked about tonight, hear that, but hopefully move through some of these other issues. Sound good? Maybe not good, but like we're gonna show up and do it.
Is this time the right time for everyone? I mean, obviously we've blown through 2.5 hours at starting with the 7 o'clock, or can we get an earlier start? I guess people maybe can give some feedback if Marcia, if you don't mind being our catcher's mitt on that feedback, so that we can maybe adjust, and that might give us a little bit more time to get through the agenda.
So maybe 6:30 or 6 o'clock rather than 7.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, Bill.
Randy put 7 p.m. is good in the chat. Randy, would 6:30 work for you? Anyways,
Yeah.
You all
We
can
can just get people to go inbound to Marcia, and then we can get a rough idea as to when we can start, and then share that with you, Catherine.
Okay. Yeah, I'm seeing some other comments from Nancy in the chat that 7 is good. I work till 6:30. Randy says, I think that's pushing it, although it did take a while to get things rolling. So yeah, you all can think a little bit more about that. We could have our soft start at 6:30 and wait for folks to trickle in and get started shortly thereafter, or some other situation. So
Yeah,
just
we'll
let me
get-
know. And
The power outages were not our friend this evening.
yeah, that's true. All right, so yeah, you'll let me know what time and I'll send out the Zoom link. And otherwise, I think it's time for us to adjourn. Any final comments?
Thank you for your work.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Thanks for the
very
efforts.
much. Thanks for the meeting.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you all for sticking with this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks, everyone, for taking.
Good
Yeah,
night.
good night. Good night from Tennessee.
Oh, good night.
Good night.
All right.
All right, Catherine. So I'm gonna hit stop recording. And you're gonna have to